Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. As the Trump administration creates tension with Europe when it comes to defense and possibly trade, can the transatlantic alliance be restored? That issue is next. My guest today is David Townley, teaching fellow at Royal Air Force College, Cranwell, at the University of Portsmouth. He is also chair of the American Politics Group, whose focus is on the government and politics of the United States. Dr. Townley, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you, Tony.
I want to start out with this. Obviously, there's a lot of tension about the transatlantic relationship right now with J.D. Vance's speech to the Munich Security Conference, as well as the tariffs that President Trump is threatening with on the EU. Not so much with the United Kingdom. There seems to be some room to work there. But one of the things that really struck me was that on Sunday, as the Christian Democratic Union won, and Friedrich Merz said the following, and I quote, "I never would have thought that I would have to say something like this in a TV show. But after Donald Trump's remarks last week, it is clear that this government does not care much about the fate of Europe. My absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the USA," unquote. What was the reaction to that? Because that is one of the sternest comments that have come out of a European leader about the relationship with the United States. So how did European leaders respond to that? We didn't hear much publicly, but what's going on behind the scenes as a result of that comment?
Adhering to what was said about trying to remove this independence from the US, I think what he said was being said behind closed doors by a lot of nations, and he's sort of come out and admitted to it. And we are in the United Kingdom. We're moving towards increasing our defence spending. We had a recent announcement yesterday. However, I would say that the increase is nowhere near enough to deal with a United States less Europe or European Union with the United Kingdom included. So I think that there is a great deal more to come from that. I was speaking to a journalist yesterday. There are a number of systems and processes in place to have a sort of security force within the European Union, but I don't see that there is anything in terms of, or there being at the moment, a great deal of enthusiasm for a European army, a permanent army. That said, I think there is a great deal depends on the outcome of the, which we say the talks, because there's no negotiations or discussions yet, the talks around ending the conflict in Ukraine and the consequences of that. Will the United States be, for example, supportive of Ukraine's security? I believe the recent deal, and I haven't seen the actual fine print yet, but the recent deal expresses support but not dedication of US military forces to Ukrainian security. And you would have to think, echoed from the German politicians and as well as the European politicians, is that there has to be a question about whether the United States is an ally that can be depended upon. Now, for somebody who has for his entire life has had the United States as an ally and as an academic of American politics, that is really quite a step back from the security and reassurance that has been there for the past 70, 80 years. So it's something that is going to, first of all, going to be mulled over and talked about. And as you said, the United Kingdom, because it's not part of the European Union, is able to have a different approach to the United States as the European Union has. But what is going on in Europe at the moment is a considerable number of governments that are scrambling to find finances for security, and to find some sort of process to ensure that their borders are protected and ensured over the next decade or so.
Now, the issue of European self-defense and spending more on defense, as you know, is not a new issue between the United States and Europe. It goes back as far as President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who talked about it as well. But the question I have is, with Europe creating its own, let's say, military, are we now looking at what is potentially a transatlantic split? Because if Europe no longer feels that the United States is a reliable partner and they're looking to go their separate ways, even with trade, I believe there's going to be a meeting between leaders of the 27 nations within the EU with some of the Asian nations to increase trade. So it seems as if they're looking to hedge their bet by moving away from some of that as well. So, what are some of the unintended consequences that can come of that?
Well, I think first of all, again, as a citizen of the United Kingdom, I am not part of the European Union. Unfortunately, I should state in my own political position there. But I think that we are a partner with them on many respects, and our current Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is trying to reset the relationship with the European Union. However, I think that depends on his how well his visit to Washington D.C. goes this week. We'll see whether it is a positive visit. I think Starmer is trying his best to. I don't want to use the word appease, to satisfy Trump's demands for increased spending. I mean, UK's spending has only really become an issue since sort of the start of this century, for the United States. Prior to that, we had a healthy, I think it was 5% around the Falklands conflict, and even 7%, I think, of GDP in the 50s and 60s. The problem for the European Union in terms of creating their own military force is finding the finances for it. A great deal of the nations now, we just come out of an age of austerity, but even our meager 0.2% increase in defence spending that was announced yesterday by the Prime Minister is at the cost of international aid, which is rather striking for a Labour government who are very much champions of international development and international aid. It's rather striking that they are swapping soft power tools for hard power, effectively. But the increase is nowhere near what we need. It's only going to fill some of the black holes. In terms of trade agreements, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a movement by Trump as well. I think we see with the minerals deal that is recently been, I think it's been agreed today, that is essentially removing his dependency on China for some of the rare earth materials that they need, especially for things such as microprocessors and some satellite communications technology. And that will allow Trump to have a more aggressive Chinese policy. At the moment, he's been met tit for tat in terms of what tariffs he puts on the Chinese matching, and he really doesn't want to have that sort of impact on his own economy. So I think in terms of Europe, there are a number of options for them. I think Asia is one particular option. I think as well whether we have a complete split, as you call it, with the United States. I don't think so. I don't think so because I don't think Trump can afford to cut off the entire trade with Europe. And I think what we'll see, and we've got to remember that Trump is a transactional president, so we've got to give something to get something back. And I think that if we want that security, there will have to be resetting of trade deals that are on much more favorable terms with the United States. Again, That's the European Union. United Kingdom has leeway because it doesn't have that restriction with the European Union, that it can negotiate its own deals. But we're starting to see certainly governments seeking alternative supply chains, and alternative sources of international trade. I think it's probably watch this space as to where they go, especially with the development of things such as AI over the next decade or so, which is going to have significant multi-billion dollar investment on both sides of the Atlantic.
And I want to raise this question because even though United Kingdom is no longer part of the EU, still what happens will have a spillover effect. So there's no doubt about that. And raise the question of the defense aspect, because I want to read something to you from Joseph Borrell, who was the former High Representative of the EU. And he says something that was quite profound. He said, the first point, and the quote, the first point, which is often misunderstood or misrepresented, is that the European project has historically been built against the idea of power. This is a fundamental point which makes the idea of power a very new one in Europe. So if we think about the EU and, back before it became that, there were all these internecine wars for hundreds of years, and the EU kind of put that to rest. But as we look at Europe becoming a military power, obviously it is already an economic power in of its own right. But if we start looking at a military power, I'm just looking at what are the potential unintended consequences of that? Because we've already seen Russia and its incursion into Ukraine. Could this have the unintended consequences of creating other military tensions within the continent of Europe, including the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So let's deal with the first one. So the first thing about a European military force is who would control it? Who out of all the nations, who would be the nation that actually has the final say? At least with NATO, we do tend to know that if the United States is supportive of something, it's likely to go ahead. In terms of an additional power block, yes, I mean Russia are concerned about NATO both as a military force and as a political force. It's also concerned about European Union as an economic and political force. There are still some economic ties with Russia that the European Union would have to diverge itself from. But if there was suddenly to be, for example, a European security force or army, for want of a better word, that was a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, for example, or alongside the sort of Polish border, that would certainly be seen by Russia as a potential threat. And Russia is, I say this as a state, as a nation, is always concerned and looking westward at potential incursions in its borders, and rightly so. It's been invaded, significantly in its history. That's not to say that the action that it takes in conducting what it calls its special operations in Ukraine is in any way justified, but I think it's understandable why they do feel this way about NATO. And adding a militarized European Union into the mix is potentially not a peacekeeping endeavor, but one that could, as you rightly say, raise or heighten tensions. That being said, without that military lever of power, it is reliant on diplomatic and economic levers of power to try and fend off any potential Russian action. And as we've seen in Ukraine, that has had very little in terms of effect on Russia. So I think Europe is right to make or to consider that decision. And I'm sure there are far more intelligent people than me in positions of power who understand the ramifications of that. But yes, we might well see that a European security force only add fuel to the fire.
Now, your prime minister, Keir Starmer, as you said earlier, is heading to the United States. President Macron has been here trying to perhaps teach the president of how he should approach the Russians when it comes to Ukraine. We'll see how that works. What do you think the prime minister's ultimate goal is in his meeting with President Trump? I mean, there's already been some, I wouldn't say capitulation, but for example, the ambassador to the United States, Lord Mandelson, has retracted his criticism of Trump and saying that his criticisms were both ill-judged and wrong. So there's a little bit of that. So what do you think he wants to get out of his meeting with the president of the United States?
That's an interesting question. So I think there's the two main subjects are going to be trade and security. So Trump has he even mentioned during his the early part of this second administration that he would consider tariffs on UK exports into the United States, which, by the way, doesn't penalise UK manufacturers to a certain degree. It penalises American buyers, the American consumers on the other side of the Atlantic, which is, I understand that it's designed to promote the consuming American goods rather than British goods. But it's to make sure that that trade agreement or the trade agreements that we do have stay in position and are no longer threatened by any tariffs. And I think in terms of security, I think you spoke about appeasement. I think the 0.2% increase in defence spending that was announced yesterday was timed to exactly coincide with this meeting, that he could come to Washington, D.C. and tell Trump, look, I am doing something that you are asking, and now it's time for you to give your side of the transaction. So I think that there is an understanding of how to deal with Trump, and I think that Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson's comments is also a lesson on learned on how to deal with Trump by, you appease his ego, you speak to his personality, you praise him, and that's more likely to get a more benevolent attitude from his administration. And so I think the United Kingdom, again, don't want to use the word bend in the knee, but there are certainly some concessions that they've made. And what we will see will be interesting to see whether there's any concessions by either side on Ukraine and any potential peace negotiations, whether the United Kingdom will be part of those, or Europe in particular will be part of those peace negotiations. I know Zelensky wants them there, but at the moment, most of the negotiations have not even included Zelensky. So where that sort of develops, we're not quite sure. So security, trade, I think that's the biggest thing. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him being courted by Starmer to visit the United Kingdom again. He, as I was told yesterday, he's he's the singular president to have been invited twice on a state visit in his first administration. So it's of course, and he is a very much an Anglophile. It may well be that might be some way to grease the wheels of industry, shall we say.
I want to ask kind of a broader question because there are people on this side of the pond who question why are leaders in Europe seemingly bending the knee to this particular president or any president? Europe is not a paper tiger. It is a huge economy, anywhere from 21 to $26 trillion, which in essence equals the United States in terms of purchasing power and the like. If you did put all the military together, and going back to your point, who would run it? And that is a serious question. But it would be bigger than the military of either Russia or the United States. And so people do wonder, why does Europe, and understanding that the United Kingdom is not part of EU, but in general, why does Europe always seem to be willing to be the junior partner?
I think so. I think first of all that so there is so you spoke about that, the economy is great, which it generally is for Europe. And if that, all the armed forces come together, they would be more than Russia and more than the United States. But I think that there is first of all, there's a difference in the economic and cultural setup. So the United States, even though it is a federalized system, you have a figurehead in the President of the United States. We don't have that with the European Union. That it's not the same sort of prestige for the President of the European Union, and as such, there isn't that sort of leadership, shall we say, in that same way. It is extremely difficult at times to get the European Union leaders to simply agree on any one thing, never mind everything. And the United States has, to a certain degree, got the ability to actually lead the way on many things, and nations falling behind. Now, I think why have we become to sort of lapsed in our own awareness of our own ability and capabilities in Europe? I certainly think so. But I certainly believe that when it comes to defense, that Russia would view a Europe as being a lot weaker as an opposition than the United States. And so for European security, the United States, even without getting engaged in any sort of operation or anything else, the fact that it is merely a partner is not only reassuring for European leaders, but is also a deterrent for any adversarial action from Russia. Now, as to why does Europe not do anything more about it? And I think it is, we do have a real difference of culture and history that stops us from really working together in the way that we used to. I mean, it's there are people still around that remember when half the continent was fighting each other, and that there are still generations that are reluctant to put those things past, and just look at the 1990s and what happens within the Balkans, for example, and you can see that we are not an entirely united group of peoples. And so I think that real diversity in Europe is, in one way, its strength, in that we have very many different views on different things that can produce or are conducive to innovation and creativity, both in art, culture, technology, etc., science. But that diversity at the same time is also a very great weakness, in that it is extremely difficult for us to come together as a body and agree wholeheartedly on anything. It may well take an existential threat or a real threat in terms of our borders being encroached as an entity to bring us together. But even then, I think that there would be enough stumbling blocks for it to act as efficiently on its own as it would without the United States.
One thing that is going to be happening, I believe, on March 2nd, there's going to be a number of foreign ministers who are coming to London to discuss defense issues. So there is going to be some of that. And I think that is in preparation for the March 6th event that is going to be taking place. What do you think is going to happen as a result of that?
Oh, now you're asking me to look into a crystal ball. Again, I think, I mean, we're 4 to 5 days away from that. So I think it's obviously it's too early for there to be any sort of negotiated truce or agreement between Ukraine and Russia. But by that point, that will probably take weeks. I would have thought, in terms of what is acceptable to one side or another. I think Trump as well would like it done quicker and sooner rather than later. And I think that that is going to have a significant impact on that. So I think that there will be both discussions. I think there'll be discussion, first of all, about the role of NATO, about NATO defenses, about whether NATO is capable of operating without the United States. The major issue for a lot of us on this side of the water is so much of our defense equipment is United States made. And so even if we were to become independent politically, we would still be very much dependent economically and industrially on what the United States can contribute. So we may well see greater enthusiasm for European collaboration on defense projects, moving away from the reliance on sort of things like the F-35 fighters that the UK does. We may see development of a new Eurofighter program. We may well see more development in terms of small arms and ammunition that is interchangeable between each nation, that doesn't require the sort of United States approval to be used in a provocative manner. So we may well start to see plans for greater collaboration amongst those European partners over the next few months. But of course, if Donald Trump turns around and says his commitment to NATO is ongoing, we will always be there. It might well change again. So we'll have to see. This is the difficult thing, is the uncertainty of what Trump's intentions are. It very much has left the European Union in a great deal of midway house between it being independent and reliant on the United States, and uncertain in which way it's going to go. So we'll find out, I would say, over the next few days what's going to happen.
Is there any consternation about the remarks of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who said that he's looking forward to unlock the door to incredible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians, which is a tremendous shift. Is there any concern about that statement coming out of the Secretary of State? Because that is something that we would never have heard, at least over the last 20 years, or at least since George Bush saw Putin's soul. So is there a concern about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we probably haven't heard anything like that since the 1990s and the fall of the old Soviet Union, and the attempt by the West to get the what was then called, just simply Russia to come across and be part of European affairs and come out of the cold, so to speak, diplomatically and economically. I think this is. It's strange to see how Rubio has completely flipped on his stance on the Soviet Union. Oh, sorry, on Russia, and I think that it plays into a bigger, a wider strategy for the Trump administration. I think Trump doesn't see Russia as a significant threat to the United States. It's not an ideological threat in the way that communism was during the Cold War. It doesn't have an economic threat. Militarily, it's far enough away to not worry about. I think from its point of view, the Trump administration sees China as its most significant threat, but it doesn't like the China-Russia relationship. And so I think if you want to weaken China, apart from number one, countering its soft power initiatives, especially in developing nations, which might, and the Trump administration might want to rethink this, but might need to include the USAID to resume as a soft power tool. But I think that if you can undermine China's relationship with its partners, certainly with Russia, and Trump seems to have a genuinely good relationship with Putin, that it may well be an opportunity for him to undermine China. That said, what does that say to European Union members and Eastern European members who are not part of NATO or the EU, such as Ukraine? What does that say in terms of support and security? It would mean that there is likely to be very little, that the Trump administration would probably put economic necessity over security of Ukraine. This mineral deal, or what comes about in terms of the rebuilding of Ukraine, might provide enough of an economic carrot for the United States to be able to just keep Russia at arm's length. But I do think that China is the main nation in the United States sights, and undermining that relationship, that Sino-Russian relationship is essential to becoming the or remaining the number one economic power in the world.
It sounds like Kissinger in reverse, quite frankly. And we'll see if it works.
It is really a huge step back. And this is what is so concerning. It's not small changes, and it's not one or two small changes. There are lots of big changes that are going on in the on this side of the water because of decisions that are taken out of their hands.
Mhm.
And that is what is concerning for many politicians. It goes back to what you were saying earlier. Well, why don't we plan for life without the United States? I spoke to a very good friend of mine the other day who is a federal employee. He's desperately unhappy because he's very pro-European, and he is fearful that it would end the relationship between the European Union and the United States. There would become this schism or split, as you put it, both politically and economically. And you can see that is damaging as much for the United States as it is for Europe.
It does seem that, Rubio also talked about a multipolar world, but it seems to me to have that, if you have Russia, if you have China, you have BRICS, you have the Global South looking to create their own regional associations. It does not seem to me that in the end, it is the best solution for the United States. It's not in the self interest of the United States to want to create all of these centers of power that it now has to compete with. So I'm not sure if they thought all this through, but you all were left out of the negotiations with Ukraine thus far. And I get, but you will be trying to do something with foreign ministers who will be going to Ukraine and trying to craft something. So, as part of that, to send a message both to the United States as well as to save face. Because if we're talking about a European peace force, for example, the Kremlin has already rejected that. So, what do you think is the purpose of foreign ministers perhaps going to Ukraine? And what would they hope to get, including United Kingdom?
Well, I think what they would hope to get, I think, as much as anything else, is an opportunity to be at the forefront of rebuilding, the vast majority of Ukrainian industry, manufacturing, etc., and to become preferred partners in that respect. But and to make sure that they are not left out of, having a slice of the pie that is available. I mean, and that's no disrespect to Ukraine, I should say. Ukraine will need those partners to rebuild itself. I've spoken about the minerals deals already, but even in Ukraine, those businesses who deal with the mineral extraction are saying that they are decades behind in terms of investment. And anybody who comes in there now is going to have to invest a lot of money before they even start to see anything coming back. When we think about making sure that there are European partners at that table, I think it's important because even if Europe isn't there keeping peace in Ukraine, it's going to have borders alongside Ukraine, and it is going to be in its interest to make sure that Ukraine is a stable region, that essentially that there is enough of a deterrent for Russia to look elsewhere for further encroachment into its neighbouring territories. So I think that Europe does have an important voice and should be heard. But Trump will not be negotiating, and Rubio will not be negotiating at any point with Europe's interests at mind. It is going to be very much America first. And it'll be what's beneficial to the United States. And so, if we can pull our focus away from Ukraine and look at the bigger picture, you spoke about contesting centers of power. It may well be that the United States is going to start to become even more insular and potentially more isolationist than it has done in the past, 85 years since the Second World War. And I can't see that that's anything good for either the United States or the rest of the globe.
Natalie Torchi had said that the Russians have taught Europeans that dependence can be weaponized. So, given that reality, where do you think this present situation will be 5 to 10 years from now? Trump will be out of office, maybe, and but Europeans have also said when Biden was came into office, and he said America is back, and European leaders said yes, but for how long? And so we are in this transition period where Europeans are no longer confident about stability of the United States. So how do you think this whole scenario is going to end up 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, I think it's difficult to see anything clearly. Again, I think you're absolutely right. 2028 is going to be significant. How much of a hit are the Republicans going to get in the midterms in 2026, for example, which is traditionally a bad time for the incumbent party in the White House? There's also, unlike the Republican Party in the last under the Biden administration, there's no clear as yet identifiable leader of the Democratic Party as a focus of opposition to the Trump administration. And there probably won't be until late 2027, which is, that and really to the Democratic Party's disadvantage. Are we going to see any continuity in terms of foreign policy into the following administration after that? Whether it's Trump or Vance, who is in the White House in 2029 as a Republican administration, as part of a Republican administration, I think it's likely to just be a continuation of the policies, but that will only change if it's in America's advantage to do so. So it's a very pragmatic but approach to diplomacy, that if it's in America's advantage to get involved in conflicts or get involved in international affairs, then it will do. But I think, again, it will come at a cost to the nations that are, the belligerent nations that are there. Now, in terms of what do I see for Russia and Europe in 5 to 10 years, that I can't see. And I can't see that because I can't see what Trump is going to do. I do think that Europe will sit and wait for the United States to completely withdraw from European affairs, whether that's take a lesser role in NATO or withdraw from NATO entirely. Until that happens, I don't think that European governments will make the necessary changes to secure themselves. In terms of foreign policy, European foreign policy with Russia, there has been a diversification in the supply chains of gas and oil to seriously weaken Russia. But that has come at a cost for consumers in Europe. So in the United Kingdom, for example, energy bills in the UK for domestic energy bills are almost double what they were before the crisis started. Now, if they were to suddenly make agreements with with the European unions to allow the resumption of supply from Russia, that would drive prices down, which is a vote winner. But it doesn't make nations independent. It makes them again beholden to Russia turning off the taps, should they so wish. It'll either be a European Union that is still sat and waiting for Trump, and I think Trump, if he's clever, will not make any definitive announcement on NATO, because he will use that as a bargaining chip for getting whatever he wants out of the European Union and the United Kingdom and Canada, of course, is another NATO member. And so we may well see that he is, quite happy to let that uncertainty become indefinite during his administration. That said, I can't remember the source, but I am led to believe that the State Department is reviewing every single active treaty between the United States and partners around the globe. Now, we had NAFTA renegotiated during his first administration. We've had various other things already around border control with Mexico and Canada already renegotiated. Are we going to see those that are very much beneficial to European nations be renegotiated at cost to European nations? We may well see. And so we may possibly see European Union member states turn to each other for support rather than the United States. But I think the world is a better place with the United States in it than out of it.
Dr. Townley, I want to thank you for joining me today. Your comments have been quite informative about the Transatlantic Alliance. So thank you for joining us today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you for joining us. Joining us again next week when we have another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.